some of you who haven't yet had a struggle with doubt probably will sooner or later. If nothing else, you may begin to have doubts when tragedy hits, especially in old age, when things start happening to good people, when bad things start happening to good people that you care a whole lot about. I know one of my grandmothers died with Alzheimer's, and many of you are familiar with that. You've had family go through that, and oh my goodness, she was such a godly woman, and it just took her apart piece by piece, that person I loved, and that created a lot of questions for me. But as usual, they were questions that sent me looking for more understanding, which came, which is the whole premise, the whole point behind these two sermons is that when doubt comes, don't panic, don't think you're committing some terrible sin, especially if you're just being honest about your questions. In fact, to deny or suppress them is like burying them alive. Only they don't die. They just reach up through the ground and grab you like a scary movie or something. And I know my other grandmother, who was a lifelong churchgoer, when her husband died and she found herself all alone, she sank into a depression, which is normal in those kind of situations. And one thing I know about depression, firsthand and from working with a whole bunch of other people, is that depression will generate doubt in almost anybody. And the reason for that is, I think, kind of simple. At least on one level it's simple. When a person is depressed, everything looks worse than it actually is. Everything looks more hopeless than it actually is. It's like this fog, gloomy fog settles over you and you can't see the light. And so when a person's depressed, like my grandmother was, she expressed some doubts that shocked me as a young student. And I responded the wrong way. You know what I did? I basically said, "Shame on you." I was 19. I didn't know any better. I basically, don't say that. Don't say that. Well, I doubt that helped. I doubt that helped her at all. That only drove it underground. But depression makes it hard to believe anything good is going to happen. And God is definitely in the good category. And so, therefore, depressed people have a harder time believing in God while they're in depression. So, next time you find yourself in a depression, or if you ever do, and you find yourself doubting, just stay tuned. That will pass as your depression does. But today I'm focusing on one doubter in particular. He's the most famous doubter in all the world. Thomas. Doubting Thomas. Although I'm going to change his name. Not the Thomas part, but I'm going to change his title. I don't really consider him doubting Thomas. I consider him Thomas, not the tank engine. Thomas, I can tell how old you are by whether or not you laughed at that. Thomas, I get serious now. Thomas the Truth Seeker. Thomas the Truth Seeker. Here's what you may already know about Thomas and why he doubted when he first heard the other disciples telling him that Jesus is risen from the dead. He's alive. We saw him ourselves. We touched him. We talked with him. We even ate and drank with him. But Thomas wasn't there. And therefore he didn't believe, because one thing Thomas was not is naive. He was not naive. He was not gullible. And also, I know it upset the other disciples when they told Thomas this good news. Probably on Monday morning, the day after Easter, they ran into him somewhere and said, "Guess what, Thomas? Jesus is alive. He's raised from the dead." And Thomas said, I don't buy that. I don't buy that. Don't you know, think for a minute, these were his religious friends. This was his faith group. And everybody in the faith group believed except for Thomas. That means there was peer pressure to believe. You know, you normally think of peer pressure as teenagers' pressure to do crystal meth or whatever. But peer pressure can come in any form, at any age, from any group of people. And it can come from believers who don't understand why you're doubting. And they can really put pressure on you to believe, which only makes it worse, because it's not something you can force. Faith is not something you can just grit your teeth and generate, not real faith. It's something that comes through seeking for yourself and finding. But think, if he had been a people pleaser, if Thomas had been a people pleaser, if he'd been overly concerned about what his friends thought, you know what he'd have done? He'd have gone right along with it. He said, "All right, I believe it. Praise Jesus. Praise Jesus. I believe it. I believe it. I believe it. I believe it." But he was not going to go along with it just because somebody else told him about an experience they had. And to me, that says something about Thomas's character. Also, it might be helpful to know that Thomas wasn't the only one who doubted when he first heard the news. The truth is that all 11 remaining disciples doubted when they first heard the news. They all did. On Easter morning, Luke chapter 24, verse 11, Mary Magdalene was the first one to meet Jesus in the garden by the tomb. She went back running to tell the disciples, and listen what the Bible says about them. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they did not believe it. You're saying an angel rolled a stone away? And you're saying Jesus was dressed up like a gardener, and then you realize, oh, that's not a gardener, that's Jesus, and he talked to you? They all doubted until they had an experience for themselves, which they finally had. Now, let me say just a bit about why these disciples, who knew Jesus so well, who'd left everything to follow him, they were not a bunch of skeptical people. They were not the kind of people that just get a kick out of mocking other people's faith. That's not a healthy kind of doubt, by the way. I'll get to that later. But these were men who believed so much that they gave up everything for him. But then what they saw at the crucifixion destroyed their faith. I've seen it over and over in people I've met through the years and read about. I mean, it's so common. When people witness or experience innocent suffering, it's one thing when somebody had it coming, you know. That can almost make some people feel good. But innocent suffering, somebody who's righteous and something terrible happens to them, that affects people's faith. And I want you to think about, can you imagine watching a crucifixion? I don't even have to describe it. I don't even want to describe it. But what if the person on the cross, in this completely helpless position, I mean, you can't, your hands are both nailed, your feet are nailed. The most powerful supernatural figure they've ever known is in this vulnerable, nailed up position, suffering horribly, although he's innocent. And what if you heard your spiritual leader speak the words of Matthew 27:46? At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, my God, why have you abandoned me?" What were they supposed to make of that? It was, by the way, a quote from the 22nd Psalm, which is those exact same words. Psalm 22, verse 1 starts that way. That's the first line. My God, why have you forsaken me? Or why have you abandoned me? In some translations, which was written by someone who lived a long time before, who also felt God had abandoned them, most likely, because they were in some terrible situation that made no sense to them. When you hear your spiritual leader expressing that he feels abandoned by God and he's questioning God, wouldn't that make you question? But Jesus too was asking an honest question. He was describing, by the way, Jesus was describing the way he felt at that moment. That's not who he was. That was not who he'd been. It's not who he was going to be. But in that darkest moment, he was simply expressing, it feels like God has abandoned me. Now, had God abandoned me? Abandoned him, there's a lot of theological speculation about that. I think a lot of it is overcomplicated. What it comes down to is it felt to him like God had. But in reality, never at any point in Jesus' life had he been more in the center of God's will than he was in that moment. And yet, even in that moment, he felt abandoned, and he was honest enough to express it. But they heard that, and darkness descended. Literally, the darkness fell over the land for the space of about an hour, the Bible says. But worse was the darkness that descended on the disciples. Everything they believed in was lost. Everything they trusted was dead. And so they're naturally wondering, what about all the wonderfully inspiring, beautiful things he said? I'm not seeing how this all fits together. Again, sometimes the answer to doubt is simply stay tuned. There was something on the way that was just as beautiful as the crucifixion was ugly. But there's no way they could know that, even though he told them, by the way, but they didn't believe it anymore. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Here's the thing. Evil and suffering in this world has always been there. It's always been there. And the writers of the Scripture You'll find it scattered throughout the Bible. For example, Habakkuk, chapter 1, 2, and 3. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? They were watching a lot of misery at the cross. And here's the deal. Suffering, evil is real, and it is true. It's just not the whole truth. Because what's also true is that as long as there's a God, there's another chapter coming to the story. And what seems like the end is not truly the end. As it turned out with the disciples, they discovered Jesus just would not stay away. He wouldn't stay dead. He just wouldn't. He just couldn't. And he came to them, and Luke 24:39 tells where he came to them. And this is when they began to believe. Luke 24:39, he said, "Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me. Make sure I'm not a ghost. Got nothing to hide here. Just check this out really good. I'm not asking you to just stay way over there and take my word for it. But don't get too close. And never mind that man behind the curtain over there. No, just come on up. Touch me, see, whatever. Check it out for yourself." But John chapter 20, verse 24 says that somebody was missing that day. Somebody was not present. Thomas. One of the disciples, Thomas, the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord," but he replied, "I won't believe it." Now how's that for being straightforward? I mean, he's not even trying to be nice and friendly about it. "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hand, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into his side. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe." Now, what I want to make sure you get this, the only difference between Thomas and all the others is that he just wasn't there when Jesus made the first appearance. I mean, he wasn't asking for anything that the others hadn't already received. He was in the same place they were before they encountered Jesus for themselves. There are some things, especially when it comes to spiritual things, other people can tell you about them. They can tell you their experiences, and those are very instructive. Those can be very helpful. They can even be inspiring, but they will not substitute. In the end, they really won't substitute for you having some sort of experience with the presence of Christ for yourself. Once you begin having experiences, personal experiences with the divine, you realize you're touched. You're not literally touching it, but then are you? You sense that spirit, and you start realizing it's real because you can feel it. And once you have that, especially once you have a number of those, you may question a lot of things, specifics, but that will give your faith an anchor like nothing else. I know as a teenager, had a really good youth group in the church where I grew up, and there were two ladies that taught it. They were mothers of two of the girls in the class, and the thing they harped on most was they taught us to have our daily quiet time, is what they called it. And they taught us to pray, and they were the first people I ever encountered, the first people I ever met in person who actually told me they prayed for things and got answers. I didn't realize people did that until I met these ladies. And they basically discipled me. And I began through that to have encounters with Spirit for myself that were very, very real, difficult to describe without cheapening them. And so, the reason I tell you that is that years later, when I was in college and I started hearing questions and challenges to my faith that I'd never thought about or heard of that were disturbing, it was disturbing, it was difficult, and it was a good thing because it forced my faith to grow up, to expand my mind. One thing it did for me, I encountered two types of college professors in general. One was the kind who would teach you to question everything so they'd make you think for yourself. And that is actually a good thing. Thank God for them. Even when what they were asking me to question was parts of my belief system. Because it forced me to think about some things, to consider some things I wouldn't have otherwise considered. It forced me to expand my mind and think bigger and wider. But there are other kind of college professors who think it's their God-given mission to destroy the faith of all the Christians in the room. I'm joking about the God-given mission, but they've given themselves this mission. They're out to destroy the faith. And guess what? During those days, I couldn't tell the difference between the two. Because at that point in my life, I was so immature, so simple-minded, that if anybody questioned anything about whatever I believed, they were bad. They'd been sent by Satan to destroy my faith. False. Some have been. Some were gifts from God. But through all of that, as many things as I questioned, the personal encounters I had with Spirit gave me such a grounding that nothing or nobody could ever take from me. And the disciples were looking for that. And they found I gotta keep moving quickly. Let me say this about Thomas. Thomas wanted to believe. If you've ever gone through a period of doubt, perhaps you know what it is to want to believe. You really do, but you just can't quite pull it off. He wanted to believe. He hoped it was true, but he also had this nagging doubt that it might just all be some delusion. And Thomas was not a man who could lie to himself. Like I said earlier, he wasn't going to believe just because others told him he ought to. John 20, 26 and 27. A full week later, 8 days after the resurrection, 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time, Thomas was with them. The doors were locked. Suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Now I need to do a Bible study and a sermon just on that part right there one of these days. Doors locked, suddenly he's with them. Whatever kind of body that was, it was not like the one you're sitting there in, Bob. It's a body you could touch. It was a body that could eat fish, but it also walked through a wall like it wasn't there. Physicists say that what looks solid to us, like this chair, for example, is actually not solid. Protons, neutrons, electrons, they're all scattered. They're actually pretty far apart. And I don't know what that has to do with it, but Jesus apparently had it figured out because he walked right on through it. He just kind of dodged those molecules, you know. He got it. I'm getting off track. But what did he say? Peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. First word, peace be with you. And when he said, when Jesus said, go ahead and put your hands in the wounds, you know what Jesus was doing? He was letting you know, I know what your struggle is. I know what your struggle is. And I'm here to help you with that. Jesus wasn't mad. There's no reason I read no sarcasm in his voice. There's not, I told you so. No, he was pleased to accommodate. For Thomas, his doubts centered around one constellation. Another big word. Centered around one thing, and that was the thing that Jesus addressed. What's your thing? That's the thing that Jesus can and will address with you. What are some helps for doubters? Let me say this one first. And you're going to be impressed because I made up this little rhyme, okay? When in doubt, don't lay out of church, that is. Don't lay off reading the Bible or Christian books, or especially books, speakers, podcasts that are addressing your subject, the subject where you're struggling to believe. I mean, goodness, on the internet, you can find a podcast on anything. And if you got questions and haven't found answers, and we talk, if it's not something I'm already familiar with, I can sure show you how to work that phone, and you can find very intelligent, highly educated people who can talk intelligently with you about your doubts. So don't lay out. And the reason I say that is it really comes back to the text itself. Thomas, you know how this all got started? That Thomas was the last to believe and went and spent whole 8 days tormented by doubt. It's because he wasn't with the others after the crucifixion. We're not told why, and we're certainly not saying it was a sin or something evil and awful. It's just very practical. He wasn't with them. if he had been there, his doubt process would have been resolved much quicker. But most likely, the reason he wasn't there is he was so despondent. He was so despondent, so psychologically disturbed, so mixed up, he went off by himself and brooded. Thomas seems to have had what they used to call a melancholy personality type. He's prone to dark moods. For example, there's a scripture from John where they were getting ready to go to Jerusalem, and it's John 11:16. Going to Jerusalem, Thomas knew what was going to happen if they went there, but Jesus insisted on going anyway, as if he thought it was his mission. But wink, wink. Then said Thomas unto his fellow disciples, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." Thomas was expecting the worst. Expect the worst and you won't be disappointed. Well, everything happened. He could say, "I told you so. I told you this was going to be bad. I told you it was going to be bad." But when it actually got bad, he went off by himself. And I'm not saying that was some terribly sinful thing to do. But thank God he did make his way back into the little fellowship. And there was something about that began changing everything. What if 8 days later, Thomas had still been out feeling sad and sorry about the condition of humanity and the world and the death of God and all this? What if he'd still been out? He'd have missed him again. And, oh man, I can't help but say this. I just noticed through the years, and I can't even think of an occasion where it's happened here, but I've noticed through the years that when people get hit with some sort of tragedy, a terrible loss, something breaks their heart, they don't come to church the next Sunday, or usually the Sunday after that. And I get it. But there's a little bit of darkness in us that will actually lead us away from the very people who could help us at the very time we need them most. And that's one reason. I bet you've heard this verse abused a lot. Hebrews 10:25. Let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another. That's not a verse that should ever be used to make anybody feel guilty for not coming to church. Good Lord. But it is very instructive. Don't give up your meeting together, but encourage one another, because there's something about faith is contagious. Just like despair, cynicism is contagious. And you know this if you hang around coffee shops early in the morning. Negativity is contagious. It's very catching. But hope, faith, joy, love, peace is also contagious. And what you catch depends a lot on where you go. Let me wrap it up this way. After this, doubting Thomas wound up taking his his refound faith, his renewed faith, his new, bigger, deeper, stronger faith. Doubting Thomas took the faith farther than any other disciple. You know, he went all the way to India, establishing churches. When the Portuguese landed in India in the early 1600s, there was they came across a church there. You know what the name of the church was? Mar Thoma. M-A-R-T-H-O-M-A. It was a church that had been established by Thomas's preaching. And on this side of his newfound experiential faith, he was unstoppable even in the face of suffering and death. He was eventually martyred for his faith. According to church tradition, he was killed in 72 AD near present-day Madras. It is said he was thrown into a pit and then pierced with a spear thrown by a Brahmin priest. That also tells you one other thing about Thomas's faith. You've come all the way to India, and you've worked so hard, but you realize you've pushed too far and you're about to get yourself killed if you don't recant. If you're Thomas and you don't really believe it, and you really didn't see Jesus, and you just kind of went along with the story because, well, the others did, and it's time to die for him, there's your chance to say, hey, fellas, I was just joking. I take it back. Let's just get on about our business. No, but he couldn't. What did the disciples say? We cannot help but speak the things we have seen and heard. Doubting Thomas took the faith a long way. But you know, he had to wade through a lot of doubt to get there. So next time you find yourself wading through doubt, keep going. In the darkest days of World War II in England, when Britain was being bombed to smithereens every night by Nazi warplanes, people were losing hope, losing morale, and that's when I'm thinking of Will Chamberlain. Churchill said to his people, when you're going through hell, keep going. Get it? It's sometimes a necessary place to pass through, but it's a terrible place to stop. And the same goes for doubt. Just remember that when you're going through doubt, keep going.